Hello, welcome back to Friday and another episode of the Matt Schoen Sociology Experience. Not too many of these left. So, seeing as we are at the end and there's not too many videos for me to record, I thought I would start this one by introducing a special external expert who I want you to be exposed to for a little bit and benefit from this person's expertise. Someone who's probably a little more familiar with issues of the environment and issues of the natural world than you or I would be. This quarantine has been difficult. We have all been in some isolation. I have not been completely alone, though. So let me please introduce my friend, Niles. Hey, turn around, buddy. What are you doing? Oh, see, look at that. He just wants to look at me. Mwah. So this is my buddy. He is learning a lot about sociology, probably more than you guys are learning, because I think he listens a little bit closer to me than you guys do. No, that's not true. But he has been a very good companion and quite honestly, I think very happy to have me here. Now, we're going to be talking about Buffalo today. Wait, what? Buffalo? Buffalo is not a city that I suspect many of you have thought very much about really at all in your life, and I understand why that is. However, I look at Buffalo as a case study of the future, right? A lot of other things have been case studies of the present, or in some cases, the past, right? Not to pick on Detroit, but Detroit's a case study of the past. Buffalo is an interesting case study of the future. So, my bird is not terribly familiar with the panic room, so I am going to turn around and say goodbye to my students. I am going to, he doesn't want to. So I'm going to take him back to his cage and take him back to a place that he is more familiar with, and then I will be right back with you to talk about Buffalo. Goodbye.
Did he do good?
He did so good.
Did he?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. Wait, what did he
All right, I am back. Several of you were clamoring for an appearance of my bird. That's my bird. Let's talk about Buffalo. In the way of review, my argument has been that environmental degradation and climate change, these two things combined together, are likely the biggest threat to long-term global stability. Maybe not in the next year or two, but certainly in a long-term sense. It's one of the rare things that has the chance to completely rewrite the system as we know it. It's also my argument, and in some ways that I admit that I'm not terribly educated about or terribly able to positioned to articulate. Cities are probably the best chance we have to overcome this threat. People who live in cities generally consume less and do so more efficiently than people living in exurban areas or in rural areas. It's probably the one place we have to increase people's wealth and limit their consumption. There's almost no other sort of social environment in which that's possible. All right. So large cities, and especially dense cities, as I've said, they use less resources, they emit less CO2 per capita, and perhaps most importantly going forward, they put more people under good climate policy. It's very interesting how many cities throughout the United States, even as the United States has pulled out of the Paris Accords, many cities like New York and San Francisco have said, we're still in. We are going to treat our city as if it were part of the Paris Accords. And that's a very interesting way to think about the urban environment as an international actor. We always think of cities in a local sense, and that is probably how they deserve to be thought of and how they deserve to be framed. But cities can be international actors the more people that choose to live in them, and the more country and national level policy becomes reflective of the will of cities and urban environments. So a case study of the future, as I've said, it is probably Buffalo. Now, Buffalo, New York is it's a part of New York. I mean, I'm sure already knew that Buffalo is in western New York, right on the banks of Lake Erie, but Even though it's in New York State, Buffalo has far more in common with cities like Detroit and Cleveland than it does with New York and Philadelphia, right? It's not really an East Coast city. It is culturally and economically and really geographically in a big sense Midwest. It is a Midwestern city. And Buffalo has suffered exactly the same symptoms of urban decay that many Midwestern cities have been prone to. So if you go through this laundry list of everything we have said that it damages cities and puts cities in a decay, in a position of decay, it's all there in Buffalo. Buffalo has lost a tremendous amount of its population. The city is home to currently about 290,000 people, which is pretty far down from its peak in the 1950s, I believe, was Buffalo's peak. Maybe the early 60s, but I don't know that for sure. When the population was about 600,000. Why have so many people left? Why is Western New York depopulating? Well, it's been a primary victim of deindustrialization, but it has not been how do I want to put this? It has not been a nationally known or like a sexy version of urban decay and deindustrialization, right? We never thought about Buffalo as being like the home of a major industry like Detroit in the automotive industry. We never thought of it in that way. Buffalo never captured the nation's attention the way a city like Chicago did, which also suffered from pretty severe deindustrialization. So all this happened in Buffalo, and nobody noticed, right? It just happened and nobody paid attention. There are pretty severe educational deficits. The percentage of people living in Buffalo with a college degree is well below the state average, well below the national average. Buffalo, believe it or not, again, and nobody thinks of it as having a failing education system the way they think of like Los Angeles having a failing education system. It just sort of happens quietly. Buffalo has unusually high gang violence. Nobody talks about Western New York as having a gang problem the way they talk about Chicago or Miami or LA having a gang problem. But the rates of gang violence in Buffalo and Rochester, a smaller Western New York city, is per capita very troubling. It's troublingly high. And perhaps most importantly, it has absolutely apocalyptic winters, right? That whole snow belt region from Cleveland through that part of northeastern Ohio up into western New York. The snow there is like, you people from Chicago, you think you have a tough winter, and you do have a tough winter, but you have not seen snow like the people of Cleveland and Buffalo get. Like, it is that snow belt, that lake effect snow is apocalyptic in the amount of snow it can just dump on the city very quickly. So what's good about Buffalo? Well, the gamble that Buffalo's making, and it's a pretty rational gamble in my opinion, is that they might emerge as one of the prime winners of a new climate regime, a new environmental reality facing the world and facing the United States. So let's look at all the cities that people love, the cities that, like, nobody talks about Buffalo as a very attractive place. Nobody talks about Buffalo as if it's a sexy place. But let's look at some of these other cities and just situate themselves within the climate reality. Miami is sinking into the Atlantic Ocean, and I, for one, say, let it. Phoenix is on fire, and I, for one, say, let it burn. It's not literally on fire. I think you guys understand what I mean by that, though. Like, the temperatures are obscene, and it's only livable given a certain type of urban infrastructure based around driving and air conditioning and all that other stuff that's not great for the environment. LA is drying out. Los Angeles has 17 million people living in the 5-county Southern California area. It's sprawled and it has no water. I guess I suspect that that's going to be a problem at some point in the future. As fond as I am of Los Angeles, the weather is incredible. It's 75 degrees every day. They don't have Buffalo's cold. They don't have Phoenix's heat. But the water is an issue. The water is a persistent issue that I worry about the long-term future of that area. New York is getting absolutely battered by storms that are going to be more frequent. The whole eastern seaboard is going to be more prone to pretty devastating hurricanes. And New York, people don't think about New York as being prone to hurricanes because it's in the Northeast. But if you remember Hurricane Katrina, why that was so deadly and so damaging in New Orleans, among many social reasons, was just ecologically speaking, New Orleans is below sea level. And so when the levees broke and the storm surge brought the water in, so much of water follows the path of least resistance, and it floods and just buries certain urban neighborhoods. Well, how do you think Lower Manhattan got the name Lower Manhattan? Nobody ever talks about this. I don't think it's well known, but Lower Manhattan is below sea level. It's not called Lower Manhattan because it's south of the center of the city. No. It's Lower Manhattan because it's below sea level. And the operating storm procedures in New York right now are to assume that if there's another major storm akin to what Hurricane Sandy in 2013, akin to that type of major category hurricane, the operating assumption is that anything south of 14th Street is going to get flooded, and that will likely continue to get worse. How about Buffalo? Buffalo's bet is that they're going to be a winner here. Miami is a loser of climate change. Phoenix is a loser of climate change. Los Angeles, New York, these are losers of climate change. Not to sound like President Trump there, call places losers. No, those places are going to get less livable as a result of climate change. Buffalo might be the rare place that actually benefits out of this. And it's not a crazy bet either. It's not a crazy assumption. A lot of the climate modeling and the scientific research is showing that Buffalo, due to a variety of factors, might be unusually insulated against the worst of climate change. It might end up being the type of city that is going to have its worst climate attribute alleviated, which is their Hoth-like temperatures, without suffering much of the problems. So let's look at what Buffalo's insulated against. Buffalo's climate has changed recently, but heat waves remain rare. There's very few days above 90 degrees in Buffalo or in Western New York. You just don't get the heat waves. And that tends to be in the upper Midwest, from Buffalo to Northeast Ohio up to our state of Michigan. The natural disaster that Michigan is most vulnerable to is heat waves, because we're not really equipped for an extended period of very high temperatures. And as I've said in these videos, I live in an apartment where I don't even have air conditioning, so that's a problem. Buffalo doesn't get many of these. Michigan is more prone to heat waves than Western New York is, and it's the effect of Lake Erie right next to it. It acts like kind of a natural air conditioner. Rainfall is predictable at the same time that LA, it seemingly has not rained in Los Angeles since 1997. That makes for a lot of pleasant sunny days where the birds are singing and it feels great outside. But long term, water is going to become a tremendous issue for urban areas. And then for even areas if you look at, there are some other cities that get rain, but they just don't have the capacity of fresh water that they would need to support their population. Thinking specifically about Charlotte here, you get rain in Charlotte, but the South is prone to droughts, and so the freshwater capacity in the rivers and the underground water is just not there. So you get all this in Western New York. You have Lake Erie there. You have this beautiful storage. Well, maybe Lake Erie is not beautiful, but it might become beautiful. This beautiful storage system for all your fresh water, all the fresh water that the 290,000 people calling Buffalo home will ever need. And that might end up meaning something. And it's going to alleviate, a warming planet alleviates the biggest current drawback. The reason why somebody like me would never want to live in Buffalo right now, I just hate the cold temperatures and I hate the snow. And granted, of course, I live in Michigan and it's like, oh, you hate the cold weather and you hate the snow. Well, for starters, you can't make all your life decisions based on the weather, but also like the winters here in Michigan are not as serious and not as bad as they are in Western New York. They're just not. So let's take a look at some of these average temperatures here. If you look at this from 1965 up to 2020, Buffalo's average temperatures has risen on average 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit since 1955. If you go to Buffalo, I promise you, it's not a problem, right? This is the rare place where warming temperatures are not having a feedback effect on other damaging elements of the climate. For starters, Lake Erie acts as a natural air conditioner. So everybody, if you're from the Detroit metro area, or if you've ever been to a place like San Francisco, being next to the water, it keeps things feeling cooler than they even actually are. You see this in Cleveland too as well, like living right next to a lake. It's a natural air conditioner right next to the place where a lot of people live. I always tell people, like, if you've never been to San Francisco and you're going to visit, bring a sweater. I promise. Even if you're like, the last time I was in San Francisco was in August. I left a very humid city, Columbus, Ohio. This was in 2014. It's been a long time since I've been to San Francisco. But yeah, I left a very humid city and go to San Francisco. Like, you got to pack a sweater, pack a sweatshirt, because it feels very cold. All that air coming off the bay. And the same thing happens in Buffalo. So it feels better than it is. And it's just a place where you don't get extreme temperatures. Well, extreme hot temperatures. So that's actually looking okay in Buffalo. It's going to get slightly milder, but you're not going to feel the intensity of heat waves the way that they are in other areas. What about rainfall? We're going to need that. This is extreme rainfall in Buffalo since 1965. That looks pretty constant to me. It looks like there was a particularly wet year here in 1987. Wait, I think that's 87, right? Yeah, so 90s right here, 89, 88, 87. The year that I was born. Also, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not coincidentally, one of the wettest years in Buffalo. But if you look at this graph here, we're not seeing a serious decline in rainfall. So this is one of the things that's becoming a problem in the rest of the Midwest. Many Midwestern cities are becoming prone to flooding in a way that they never used to be. Europe as well, Northern Europe is becoming prone to flooding in a way that it never used to be. Not Buffalo. You're getting constant, but not extreme rainfall. And that's an interesting structure to operate from into the future. And then finally, they have fresh water, which is perhaps the most important resource cities are going to need to advertise going forward. They have fresh water, and I realize that, yeah, might be a bit of a misconception to describe Lake Erie as fresh, but you know what I mean here. You know what I mean. So many scientists are believing that Western New York as a region, it's pretty well positioned for the new climate reality. It's going to get warmer, but it's not going to feel overwhelmingly warm. It's not going to get extreme heat waves. It's not going to get extreme rainfall, and it's not going to experience drought in a way that would limit the fresh water that the city has to draw from. And over time, I think that you're going to see states assert much more control over their own state, their own reserves, so to speak, of fresh water. As of right now, do you know what happens to a lot of the Great Lakes water supply? We here in the United States and in the Great Lakes region sell a lot of fresh water to the petrostates of the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, Dubai, and Qatar. Why do we sell them all that fresh water? Well, we have water and we don't have oil. They have oil and they do not have water. Over time, they figured out you cannot drink oil. No, you see what I'm saying here. It's not that they figured that out. It's like they're trading off a surplus of what they have to alleviate a deficit of what they do not have. Over time, I think that like right now, we always talk about the Middle East as a place of ethno-religious conflict. I think it's the world's prime suspect for where the first water war might break out. When you look at Syria, Iraq, many of these, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the rivalries that those countries already have. So I hope you're seeing my argument here. From freshwater rainfall temperatures, Buffalo is looking pretty good. And if you think about the urban area, Buffalo has lost 70% of its population from its peak to where it is right now. That creates a lot of vacancy that hurts everybody. So whereas many cities are at risk of gentrification and some of the negative byproducts of that, Buffalo is not really at risk of that. It might be a long-term risk of gentrification, but certainly at the start of it, Buffalo's got room to grow. It's got room to infill. It's got room to grow from a population perspective. So what you're seeing in the population of Buffalo from a peak in 1950, yeah, so there you go. It was 1950 of 600,000 down to below 300,000. The population of Buffalo is less than half of what it was in 1950. And there is not any current sign that in the next few years that's going to start to turn around. But maybe there are, because if you look at real estate prices in Buffalo, those are actually going up. I'll show you a graph on that a little bit later. So yeah, so Buffalo's got room to grow. I would look at Buffalo and say they don't need to worry about gentrification in the near term. They might have to worry about it in the long term, but certainly not right now. If you consider the alternatives, Buffalo is starting to look pretty pleasant to me. Like, I always made fun of Buffalo for a couple reasons. One, I was and probably still am an annoying New Yorker, and Buffalo is like, it's my home state's second largest city, and it feels like it's another planet. Yeah, I remember the first time I part of it, chalk this up to just me being a stupid child, but I remember being a little kid, like young, and asking my family, asking my dad if he would take me to a Buffalo Bills football game, because in the early 90s, the Bills were a really good team, right? They were going to Super Bowls, losing all of them, but they were going, which is more than I can say for the Cleveland Browns. And I had no idea like how far away Buffalo was from where we lived, right? We lived in an inner suburb of New York City. And Buffalo, that's an 8-hour drive from New York City. It's the complete other end of the state. And I remember him laughing at me like, Buffalo, football game in Buffalo. God, that's a weekend trip. That's not just going to the game and coming back. And again, it's like as a resident of New York State, like I could have gone and gotten in-state tuition going to SUNY Buffalo, which is a decent school, but it's like Buffalo feels like another country if you live in this suburban New York City area. It's like, what, Buffalo? God, I might as well go to another country for college at that point. Doesn't really seem like staying in state, even though it is. So what you're seeing on here is the projected change in average temperature by 2100. The top line that you hear is Miami-Dade County. The pink line that you see here is New York County, so it's New York City. And the that looks like blue, or is that purple? Blue, down at the very bottom. Average temperatures over time for Erie County. Erie County is the county where Buffalo, New York is located in. So the average temperature currently is a little below 60 degrees, and that's going to go up to about 63 to 64. That honestly sounds kind of pleasant to me. That is going to put Buffalo by 2100, like Miami is probably not going to exist in its current form. Yay. No, I mean, that's going to suck for everybody that has investments there and everybody that has lives there. But New York is prone to the urban heat island effect. Miami is very prone to rises in sea levels. Buffalo might just look normal and a little bit warmer during the winter and a little bit less snowfall. It does not strike me as the worst situation. So many experts are looking at the 21st century and what urbanism is going to look like, and are projecting that, we're going to see a movement. If the late 20th century was about a movement from the industrial Northeast and Midwest down to the post-industrial Southeast and Southwest, we're going to see a reverse migration, right? Places like Buffalo and Milwaukee might all of a sudden become climate refuges, I should say, whatever. And there's a bit of progress on Buffalo's part here. Buffalo's mayor has declared the city to be a climate refugee haven. Like that's the mayor of Buffalo's exact words. And now that Tom Brady isn't kicking their ass twice every year, maybe the Bills will actually go to the playoffs once in a while. And so what does this mean? What does a city need to do to prepare for this south to north movement that most people argue will happen? Well, Buffalo has had some progress here, but it's like kind of on the margins of what would need to happen to really make it a home in a post-global warming environment. They've put in a bunch of LED streetlights, but yeah, so have a lot of other places. They're getting in on solar panels, but that needs to be, we need governmental policy to make that cheap and effective. And specifically, we need to stop subsidizing coal and subsidizing oil. And if fossil fuels did not get subsidized, then green energy all of a sudden looks a lot cheaper than it currently does. They're planting a bunch of trees, right, to kind of maintain green space. They're upgrading the sewers, which just like Flint and Detroit have not been upgraded in a century. So that seems reasonable. But that all seems like small potatoes to me. How should a city in the Northeast like Buffalo plan to stay livable? Because if you have this mass influx of people trying to get out of a place that's sinking or burning, and they all end up in Buffalo overnight, then the progress is not going to be maintained. So how can Buffalo plan to move on from this? Well, high density, plan for infill first and exfill later, and build a lot of housing, right? The second there starts to be demand, build a lot of housing. Upgrade the public transportation. I mean, all cities should be doing this, but especially cities that plan to grow. One of my big frustrations with living in Columbus, a city I otherwise really liked, one of my elements of frustration was that it was this big city. It was the 13th largest city in the country. And it was in fact the largest city in the country without any type of light rail. That was very frustrating for me. And Columbus is an area, the infrastructure is not developing fast enough to keep up with what is happening on a population level. They need to take some steps to preserve green space. They have green space right now. They need to preserve it. And that might mean leaving certain lots empty. But you don't have to leave them completely vacant. Turn them into parklets. I think that's a really good thing going forward, is to maintain pockets or islands of green within a city that is developing and is growing. And of course, look, I guess I should be upfront here. I am very much making an assumption that Buffalo will continue to grow. I'm definitely making an assumption that Buffalo will be one of these winners. And, who knows what the hell's going to happen? Do I have a crystal ball? I wish. I do not have a crystal ball. Otherwise, I would have, done something so that way my retirement account doesn't get walloped the way that it has. And most importantly, keep it affordable. Because currently, one of the biggest draws, if you were trying to draw me to Buffalo, the cost of living is something that I would pay attention to. People always ask me, do you miss New York? And my answer is kinda, but not really. I miss people, sure. I wish I saw family, and I wish I saw friends from my childhood more frequently than I currently do. But I look at New York, the cost of living is not something I look forward to going back to. And look, there are jobs I would absolutely take back in New York. There are absolutely jobs I would do. But I also personally feel that I will achieve my goals and I will achieve the ambitions I have for myself and my career right here in the Midwest. And Buffalo's the Midwest. You can get for $39,000 a year what you need $100,000 to get you in Manhattan. That's insane. But that's how expensive some of these superstar cities have unfortunately become. you need $100,000 a year in Manhattan to get the same standard of living as $40,000 in Buffalo, New York. That's crazy. So it's affordable, and that's good. So let's keep it that way. There's some evidence that people are taking notice here. Buffalo's home values are actually increasing quite rapidly. The population is not really going up, but the home values have risen in Buffalo faster than the rest of the United States, and actually faster than New York City. So there's a little bit of perhaps a start of a gentrifying movement in Buffalo. Good. I say let it, but I also say plan for it and plan to protect the population that has stuck it out and has rode out some very difficult times, right? Like exactly what has happened in Detroit, the same crap has happened in Buffalo. And those people have a right to benefit from a city that has experienced quite a dramatic amount of decay over the last half century. So while I would say Buffalo's almost like an urban planner's laboratory here. I would tell an urban planner, here's my prediction. Buffalo is a city that is going to become a more attractive place to live. Buffalo is a city with a lot of vacant space. Buffalo is a city that is willing to do things differently going forward. How can you create a green, environmentally sustainable, socially sustainable city? Because I guess if I think like very long term by 2100, one of my biggest fears is that cities get prone to climate gentrification. Like instead of it being post-industrial gentrification right now, like what we have right now, it becomes cities like Milwaukee and Buffalo that all of a sudden get attractive in a much warmer planet. And you end up with like basically a situation, like I don't think this is going to happen, but one of my bigger fears is that in 2100, we're talking about Buffalo the way we talk about San Francisco right now. Like, oh, it's completely unlivable. It just got out of control very quickly. And that will take some policy. There's some evidence that cities, like people do make consumption decisions based on environmental factors. Because in Miami, that city that is sinking into the Atlantic Ocean, prices for real estate in areas that are on high elevation, they're skyrocketing. The wealthy are parking their money and their investments in places that are going to be most protected from hurricanes and from storm surges and from rising sea levels. So here's my challenge to Buffalo. It has space, but can they build the will, the political capital and the social will to preserve that long-term advantage and to make it an equitable refuge for people who don't want to live in Atlanta and Miami and Houston a long time from now. But perhaps the biggest reason I can say why that won't happen is it would involve long-term planning, which we have not been particularly good at, as many things will evidence. So on behalf of my bird and I'm signing off. I'll be back next week with some discussion about the future and some discussion about finishing that paper really, really strong. Keep those outlines coming. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have. Thanks very much. Take care of yourselves. Bye.